Hello and welcome. We're going to talk about the past, the present and the future of HACCP. We'll do the second part. It's a presentation in 3 parts and we're now in the second part. And the second part is about FSSC ISO 22000. And I will talk about ISO 22000 in relation to the food safety bow tie. And the food safety bow tie was in the first part of this presentation. And we're now going to see ISO 22000, FSSC 22000, how do they relate to the bow tie. This is what a bow tie look like. And I've been trying to explain in the first presentation about the different levels of control. What you're looking at now is the primary level. We found a solution for the problem of salmonella. But we're also aware that there can be problems to that solution of that pasteurization. This is the secondary level. There is a problem in the pasteurization and that problem is solved with a thermograph. But also the thermograph might fail, that might have reliability problems. So here comes the third level of control. This is important understanding, these different levels of risk management. So here's an example that I found just in the field. And this is an interesting example. There's 2 different sites, sites A, site B. They're doing the same thing. They got the same raw materials, the same process and the same product. But when you look at their HACCP system, there's differences. There's one side that says my hazards are pathogens like Bacillus cereus or Listeria, Salmonella. They've got a control measure they call heat treatment and they've got a corrective action in the flow divert. Now side B comes up with a different kind of hazard. It says insufficient microbiological reduction and the control measure is the test of the flow divert and the corrective action is the blockade of the batch. These are 2 different sites. They're in the same company but they have a different HACCP. And they might talk for days but they won't find a solution because they got a total different concept of how it's done. Now, I've been telling about this primary, secondary level of control, and here is this primary and secondary level of control. The primary level is about the hazard and the control measure. The primary level is about controlling hazards. The secondary level is about controlling deviations. Now, when we take this as our benchmark and we look at the examples, then we can see that this is actually correct. This is, in terms of the definition, these are hazards. And control measures are pasteurization, like heat treatment. And also the corrective action can be the flow divert. It's basically correct. What we have done in side B is, what we identified as a hazard is actually a deviation. And test of a flow divert valve is not a control measure. Control measures can prevent hazards or they can reduce hazards. You cannot reduce or prevent salmonella with a divert valve. Salmonella don't care about divert valves. They care about pasteurization. They're pretty scared of pasteurization. They're not scared of diverting valves. So this is not a control measure. This is basically a corrective action. So something's going wrong over here. And then you might think, well, this is side A and side B and they might have different concepts of HACCP, which happens. People have different concepts of HACCP. But now we turn to one and the same factory and they have one concept of HACCP. And what we're looking at now is 4 different CCPs. And when we look at how they describe their hazards in that CCPs, then here we have the growth or presence of pathogens, and here we have also the growth of pathogens, which is basically right. These are hazards. It's not very precise, not as precise as over here with the different names, but okay, could do. But here they have insufficient preservation as a hazard, and here they have insufficient heat treatment as a hazard. Insufficient preservation is not a hazard, it's a deviation. The control measure is preservation and insufficient preservation is a deviation. Heat treatment is a control measure and insufficient heat treatment is a deviation. So here's the same mistake within one company. So within one concept of HACCP, they make mistakes. We did some research on that, on these mistakes, and we did research at 30 CCPs, and we found in more than half of the cases this type of mistake. And this is in the Netherlands in 2018 it was. Yeah, it was research done by Victor Tilburg on Wageningen University. So that's pretty shocking actually. Now, how should we deal with these kind of mistakes? We got to understand this primary, secondary and tertiary level of control. And when we look at ISO 22000, this primary level of control is in subclause 8523. It wants you to assess the likelihood and severity of hazards and then select your control measure. The secondary level of controlling deviations is in another subclause. It's in 8524. And then you have to assess the likelihood and severity of failure and consequently do monitoring and corrective action. And of course in ISO 22000 there is also the tertiary level of verification, which is in clause 8.8. So ISO 22000 is actually doing a pretty good job in separating these different levels of control. Here are the definitions of CCPs and OPRPs in ISO 22000. And even within these definitions you can find the same separation between these different levels. Here is again the levels, and when you look at the definitions, which are again a lot of words, but the first part of these sentences is about controlling hazards. That's true for CCPs, but it's also true for OPRPs. And the second part of this definition is about the control of deviations. And it's also true for OPRPs. So ISO 22000 is heading in the right direction. What we see over here is a decision tree. And also you can see here the yellow color for the primary control of hazards and the secondary control of deviations in the blue part. This decision tree was published as a guidance in FSSC in December 2018. Next thing I will be talking about is a little bit about these CCPs and OPRPs, because that's kind of difficult stuff. But first keep in mind that separation of the primary and secondary level of control. The food safety bow tie approach that I've been talking about is also referred to as barrier approach. Barrier approach. You got a cause and a problem, and in between you put a barrier. Now that's very much the case in the Netherlands how we deal with dikes, right? We got to struggle with water, and therefore we use dikes as barriers. What it looks like is in HACCP, we've got hazards and consumers, and we don't want them to get together, right? The first thing we've done is do prerequisites. With prerequisites we can make sure that consumers won't get their feet wet. And with that prerequisites we can deal with a part of the hazards. We call them non-significant hazards. But there are significant hazards, and you cannot deal with significant hazards just with prerequisites. The prerequisites are about 190 different requirements, like washing hands, wearing hairnets, and no jewelry, and have working clothing, and pest control, and good buildings, good equipment. These are all in your prerequisites. But for significant hazards you need something extra. You need what we call a control measure. And the difference very much between these prerequisites and these control measures, if a prerequisite fails, then a consumer is not likely to experience that, to suffer from that. Once your control measure fails, then your consumer will get wet feet. So these control measures are important. We have to make sure that these control measures are capable. So this one is not capable. That would be pasteurization for like 3 seconds. It's not enough. You have to have 15 seconds. And this will be 15 seconds. So this is a capable control measure, but is it reliable? If there will be a deviation, the deviation will be a high risk in a control measure. So to detect these deviations, we need monitoring and corrective action. So this is again this primary and secondary level of control, right? Okay. So now when we look at HACCP, the risk of these deviations might be low, moderate or high. With prerequisites, the risk of deviations is low. You can afford to have a deviation every once in a while. You cannot afford to go without prerequisites. You need to have them, but you can afford a deviation. With CCPs, a deviation is a high risk. You cannot not afford to have a deviation. These products that are produced under deviations cannot go into the market. They're unsafe. So now luckily for CCPs, we might have high risk of deviations, but we have good feasibility of detection and correction of deviations. So whenever there's a deviation, we can do a corrective action. The feasibility is high. Now in applying HACCP, HACCP is basically about prerequisites and CCPs, but there is some kind of need for something in between. We call it OPRPs. For instance, if you have a raw meat product or a raw fish product, you can put it in a fridge at 2 degrees centigrade, or you can put it in a freezer at -20. You can understand that if you have a deviation of 10 degrees in the freezer, then you'll go from -20 to -10, which is not very much of a problem for food safety. But if you have that same kind of deviation in a fridge, then you go from 2 degrees centigrade to 12 degrees centigrade. And that is a high risk deviation. So basically it's the same kind of control measure, but the risk of deviation is totally different. And that cooling might be a CCP, and that freezing, we will call it an OPRP. Basically that freezing is much more about the quality of the product than about the safety of the product. So that's an in-between position. But that's not all. Because we also find in our production of food that there's positions over here. We have a high risk of deviations and a low feasibility of detection and correction of that deviations. Practical example, when you buy a product and it states, may contain traces of nuts. We're making cookies, and we're making cookies with peanuts. And to make sure there's no peanuts ending up in the cookies without peanuts, we do cleaning. But we're not too good at this cleaning. We make mistakes, and we cannot guarantee that once in a while a bit of peanut ends up in the cookies without peanuts. So we have a control measure that's not very reliable. And we don't have any monitoring procedures to detect these deviations. So the only thing basically we can do is to warn our consumer that it's a unsafe product for people with peanut allergy. So we state on the product, may contain traces of nuts. We're over in this corner, and the challenge is in HACCP to get out of there. This kind of warning does not just apply to allergens, but it's also for pregnant women. Pregnant women are warned to not consume certain type of products, like raw fish products, raw meat products, raw milk products. These are unsafe products for some people, and there should be warnings about these products. So we would like to get rid of these warnings, but that could either mean that we increase our feasibility of detection and correction so that we turn this OPRP into a CCP, or another possibility would be to reduce this risk of deviation. When we're producing cookies with peanuts and cookies without peanuts, then we might decide to produce these cookies with peanuts somewhere else in the factory. And then the risk of peanuts getting to the other product will be lower. So the risk of deviation will be lower. And then we might find ourselves up here and say, well, we've done so much on control measures, and these control measures are pretty reliable. We can do without that disclaimer of may contain traces of peanuts and nuts. And to complete this all, here in the lower corner might also be PRPs. For PRPs, it doesn't really matter much if you have low or high feasibility of monitoring corrective action, because there is low risk of deviation. This is actually key to the understanding of all PRPs. Okay, now CCPs and OPRPs is really about the need and the visibility for monitoring corrective action. And that's complicated. That's complicated because There's so many different control measures. And for one product there might be 3 or 4 or 5 or maybe even 10 control measures. And if this control measure fails, it's not much of a problem because we've got this one. And we might either choose to call this one a CCP or that one. If this one is the CCP, then that might be the OPRP, and if this one is the CCP, then that might be the OPRP. It's basically a matter of choice, but consequent to the choices, if you call this one a CCP, then you have monitoring and corrective actions over here, and if you call this one a CCP, then you have your monitoring and corrective actions over here. So this is one situation. Another situation, real life situation might be this one. There are control measures that hardly ever do anything. There's metal detectors in industry that haven't found any piece of metal in the past 5 or 10 years. So if that metal detection fails, then should you then stop production? Come on. There's also this type of control measure. It's very reliable. You can do monitoring, you can have corrective action, but it has no additional value to the safety of the food, because that control measure will work anyway. An example of that would be the time that we had in the pasteurization, the 15 seconds, very reliable. And there's a couple of other examples, not too many, but there are some. Yeah, the cleaning in between the production of peanut cookies and non-peanut cookies, the cleaning is a very poor control measure. There's only a small incident could cause the consumer to find that trace of peanut, and it's very hard to monitor. How are you going to monitor such a thin control measure? So that's a typical situation, and there's also this situation. Of course, we made this dike to prevent the flooding and people people from drowning. But we also use this dike for our highways. And when you're driving on this dike from the highways, you're not thinking, oh, I'm driving on a safety measure. No, it's an easy way to get from one place to another. Practical examples in food would be baking of bread. The baking of bread is going to kill your salmonella. But bakers are not very much aware of that. They are baking the bread to get a nice crust and to produce a bread, and they're working on the quality of the product, and the safety is more or less a side effect. There's many situations like that. So that's what makes HACCP a little bit of complicated. Okay, to deal with this complicated stuff, we at Précon, we developed a kind of toolbox. And one of the things in the toolbox would be, of course, a decision tree, which you can also find in FSSC 22000. Another tool would be a risk matrix like this. There will be tables to do your analysis, the primary control of hazards and the secondary control of deviations, and then responsibilities for critical limits and monitoring and corrections and verifications and so on. So this is an analysis table, and to keep all these things together, the analysis table and the risk matrix and the decision tree, we do books like this. This is a roadmap to HACCP, and it describes how you should work with these tools. So that's the toolbox. This is the end of presentation number 2. When we look at presentation number 3, we will look at ISO 22000 and the food safety bow tie, together with the general principles of food hygiene. And the big question will be, are they heading in the same direction? But that we will discuss in part 3. So thanks.